All right, well, let's go ahead and get going here. I know everyone's got a busy day ahead of them, busy week. So we'll get this kick started. So welcome. I'm Mike Leonard. I'm Vice President of Government Affairs for the American Sport Fishing Association. This is now the third in what I think is going to be a four-part series of webinars that we're doing in conjunction with Merger Strategies, Rick Crawford here. Looking at sort of the general theme of sustainability. We've done one on the Sustainability Toolkit, ran through a sustainability assessment, and now we're going to move into a bit of a more specific topic as we're getting more kind of into the nitty gritty here, and that is extended producer responsibility regulations for packaging, which was not a phrase I knew existed until Rick brought this to our attention, and maybe others in the industry are feeling the same way, but it sounds like something we are going to be one way or another becoming more familiar with over time. And so, as we were talking a little bit here at the beginning, it's always good, as the industry's trade association, to try and get out in front of these issues, help our members get out in front of them, so folks aren't caught flat-footed when regulations and requirements are at their doorstep. It's always good to be prepared ahead of time, and this looks like one of those issues too. And just a quick reminder for folks, we've worked with Rick on a sustainability toolkit that's available on the ASA website. Tons of great information there on a wide range of topics that fit within the general theme of sustainability, all viewing it from the lens of a business within the sport fishing industry, and how focusing on sustainability is not only good for the environment and the natural resources that we all care about and depend on, but ultimately also good for your bottom line in terms of saving money, retaining employees, attracting customers, all those great things. So with that, Rick, seeing as how I'm one of the least familiar people on this call with extended producer responsibility, I should probably quickly pivot to folks that do know a whole lot more about it. So Rick, I'll now turn it to you if you want to introduce Lynn and Caroline, and we can jump in. But I guess real quick before we do that, for folks that are going to have questions during this webinar, just a reminder, we'll save those until the end. A couple ways to ask questions when we get to that point. You can either use the raise hand feature. This is supposed to be sort of what your screen looks like. You can use the raise hand function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or type a question in the chat, and we'll get those answered for you. But again, we'll save those until the end. So with that, Rick, I'll turn it to you, and I will also make Caroline the host so that she can share her screen. So thanks.
All right, thanks, Mike, and thanks, American Sport Fishing Association, for continuing to roll out some hopefully informative webinars for members, especially related to sustainability. As Mike had mentioned previously, we created this sustainability toolkit. I think it's got a lot of powerful resources for your business. But and if you recall, or you go back and look back, we had a section on what are the main drivers for sustainability, and it can be mitigating climate risks. It can be your employees are demanding it. Big box retailers are demanding it. But one of the major significant drivers is also related to regulations. And so we're starting to see increasingly that there's different types of regulations, whether it's climate related. In this case, this is more of a EPR for packaging related regulations in some states. But I just wanted to provide just that very sort of brief overview, and also encourage anyone who has not completed the basic sustainability assessment tool. That's what we did the second webinar on. And if you haven't done that, the reason I think that's important is there is a little section on packaging within that that's sort of related to what we're talking about, that can help you maybe get some baselines going for your packaging, and just start to think about ways that you can improve that. So I know we've got a lot to cover today, so I'm also going to be very brief and just say thank you to Lynn Talley. She's with a New Earth Project, and Caroline DeLoach. She is with Atlantic Packaging. And with that, I'm just going to hand this over. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome, and we're so delighted that you're participating in the webinar on navigating extender producer responsibility, also known as EPR for packaging. As Rick said, I am Lynn Talley. I'm with the New Earth Project, which is Atlantic Packaging's sustainability initiative. And we also just want to thank you all. We appreciate American Sport Fishing Association and Emerger Strategies for organizing and hosting this webinar. We are here as a resource for all ASA members. Next slide. Just briefly, kind of an overview. During the webinar, we're going to give an overview about EPR and why it is used. Going to dive deeper into California's EPR laws. And then we're also going to discuss proactive steps that your business can actually start taking now to get ahead of the transition. As Mike said, we will have a Q&A portion at the end of the presentation to answer your questions. So definitely drop them in the chat as they come up. Obviously, your question may get answered as we go throughout, but when they come up, go ahead and put them into the chat. Brief history about us. Atlantic Packaging is the largest privately held packaging company in the US. And as Atlantic Packaging Sustainability Initiative, a New Earth Project has a real strong interest in helping our customers to better understand EPR and the impact it is going to have on your business. So like I said earlier, we are here as a resource, and we are happy to pass on what we know so that you can make informed decisions on your business and your business packaging needs moving forward. But I'm now going to pass it on to our incredible Director of Sustainability to take us through this webinar, Caroline DeLoach.
Thanks, Lynn, and thanks everyone for having us. Before we jump into this topic, what I'll say is, compared to some of the other webinars that you've had before, some of the sustainability stuff that you've touched on, I'll reiterate that this is probably more policy specific and more packaging specific than you've gotten before, and that's okay. But what I will say is that if you are selling a good that comes in packaging, this probably does affect you, even though it's not like a nationwide law or anything yet. And so I'll break it down as best I can. I'm going to move relatively quickly because we often find that some of the meat of this is in the Q&A section. But if we get to the end and you need me to repeat something, I'm more than happy to do that. But let's first talk about what EPR is, just generally speaking. So at a high level, EPR is a policy approach, and it's a policy approach where producers, we'll talk about who those are in a minute, are responsible for the entire life cycle of their product, including disposal and recycling. So we'll come back to what exactly that means in practice, but let's first just go into why are we even talking about a situation where producers need to be responsible for their product. As a lot of you are aware by virtue of the membership of this association, we have a huge plastic waste problem in this country and around the globe, and packaging is the largest contributor to that. About 75% of all plastic ever produced has become waste, and we're not fantastic at recycling it yet. So a lot of this is winding up in our natural environment, and that's obviously a big problem. And as I alluded to, simultaneously, the recycling has only gotten harder, especially for some of those plastic packaging materials. Some of you may have heard in the grapevine that China stopped accepting US recyclables in 2018 due to high contamination rates. And what that made happen was this kind of big wake-up call about just how much packaging waste we were producing and how badly we were recycling it at home. When those exports stopped happening, a lot of US municipalities couldn't afford to recycle as cheaply, and so many have discontinued their recycling programs. And then alongside all of this, the amount and complexity of packaging that we're using has only continued to increase. Only a couple generations ago, there were only a few types of packaging. think about like the milkman model, there were pretty easy systems for reusing and recycling those packages, but now there are hundreds of different types. And our recycling system just can't really keep up. And so this is not a sustainable system that we have right now. So what is the current life cycle of a package and whose responsibility is it at each point? So up until the point where a package is sold to you, and of course, whatever that package is holding, the good that is being packaged, the brand is responsible for it. They design it, they manufacture it, and they get it into retail locations or wherever to sell it to you. But once they sell it to you, the consumer or the taxpayer, you're the one who's responsible for it. You're the one who actually disposes of it, and you pay the direct costs for disposing of that package through your taxes, or sometimes through private collection services, things like that. And then collectively, we all pay these kind of indirect costs for environmental externalities that come from packaging pollution in our environment, like when we all have to pay these cleanup costs. So in that current paradigm, the producers, the brands, have pretty much no economic incentive to design their packaging to reduce those environmental externalities or to reduce the cost on you, the consumer. So why do we need EPR for packaging? So under a packaging EPR system, instead, what we would be doing is having a system where producers share some of or all of the responsibilities for the life cycle of the product or the package, including the impact that that package has at its end of life. So how can we extend that producer responsibility up through the point where you are disposing of that package? So now returning back to that definition that I was giving you at the very beginning, EPR as a policy approach exists for a variety of products already. There are EPR policies out there for things like paint, tires, mattresses, and now in the US for packaging. So what does this actually look like on the ground? EPR for packaging basically requires that producers pay fees based on the amount and type of packaging that they use. And sometimes they are also considered what we would call operationally responsible for that packaging, not just financially responsible. So when I say producer, who exactly do I mean? The producer, for the sake of packaging EPR, is pretty much always the brand selling the packaged good whose logo appears on that package. They are the producer, not necessarily like the manufacturer of the packaging, but the brand who made the decision to use that package. So to reiterate, what that basically means is that the brands are going to pay fees based on the amount and type of packaging that they use and are selling into whatever the state is that has the regulation. So going back to our life cycle, that creates a few different incentives, right? So if you as the brand are charged fees based on the amount of packaging you sell into the state of, for the sake of argument, California, then that means that you have, you also are going to have some lower fees for packaging materials that are more recyclable or maybe made from recycled content or that are designed to be reusable. The fees are not one size fits all. The fees are lower for more sustainable packaging. So this creates upstream incentives for two things. The first thing it creates an incentive for is just to use less packaging. If the fees are based on weight, then you just generally want to use less packaging. And then for the packaging that you do need to use, there are incentives to use more recyclable packaging. So I mentioned that there are these lower fees for packaging materials that are more sustainable. In the world of EPR, those are referred to as eco-modulated fees. I'm going to skip this slide and go into the roles and responsibilities in packaging EPR programs, because I think that this kind of helps paint the picture of the ecosystem of who is who and who's paying what and doing what in this system, because it can be a little bit confusing. But at its very most basic, like I was just mentioning, the main flow of money here is that the brand owners are paying fees on that packaging to a group called the Producer Responsibility Organization, also called the PRO or the PRO. And so what is the PRO exactly? The PRO is basically a coalition of all of the producers. All of the producers who sell into that given state, whether they're based there or not, are members of the PRO, and there's leadership of the PRO that is working to charge the brand owners these various fees. And so it's not actually like the state that is administering like a lot of this program. A lot of it is kind of self-run by the producers. So what does the PRO do with that money that it collects? Well, it does two major things. On the left, you'll see that one of the main things the PRO is doing is basically reimbursing the local government and the recycling service providers for the costs of disposal. And what this essentially boils down to is that they are reimbursing the costs for disposal of all of their packaging. They become financially responsible for those costs, and so that should lower taxes and fees for consumers. And then on the other side, the PRO is also working on improving the system overall. So they may be sending fees to the material recovery facilities. Those are the sortation facilities where our consumer-bound recyclables go when we put them in our blue bins. So this might go towards modernizing those facilities or improving consumer education. So there's kind of a direct reimbursement part and an ongoing long-term improvement part of where these fees are going. And then on the other side here, you may be wondering, well, okay, if the producers are running this system, then what is it that the state is actually doing? Well, the PRO is ultimately accountable to the state for the performance of these laws. So the PRO submits performance data to the state agency, basically the state version of the EPA. And that state is holding the PRO responsible for meeting certain standards or making sure that all of the costs are covered, things like that. So one of the things I kind of like about these EPR programs is it isn't just the state government that is doing all of the administration. You get a lot of private sector efficiencies by virtue of it being run by producers, but the state is ultimately the one being holding everybody accountable for meeting different standards. And then at the top, you'll see that at least all the states that have passed EPR for packaging laws so far have some kind of advisory group made up of various stakeholders who want to make sure that these programs succeed. So that may include folks from the packaging industry, from local government, from municipal government, from environmental justice groups. And so they are also kind of keeping an eye on all of this. Actually, Atlantic's president, Wes Carter, sits on the advisory board for the California law. So it's been really interesting to see the kinds of topics that come up there. So I told you about, generally speaking, what the PRO is, but do we know what the PRO is in practice in the US? And the answer is yes. There is a group called the Circular Action Alliance that has been named as the Producer Responsibility Organization in 3 different states so far, and they are anticipated to continue to be named the PRO in other states as that process keeps moving and as other states pass these EPR laws. So CAA was basically founded by 20 of the largest companies in the US, your Procters and Gambles and your Amazons, your Walmarts. And so what is kind of good about this development so far is that it would be really challenging if we had a different PRO in each state. And right now, the way that this is going, it's looking like CAA is going to be this kind of national body with state level franchises. And so even though we're going to have a patchwork of laws, at least the PRO seems to be uniform across the state. They have slightly different requirements in different states, but hopefully that should help with some of this organization. So where all is this happening? So there are EPR laws, EPR for packaging laws that have been passed and are in the process of being implemented in 5 states: Maine, Oregon, Colorado, California, and Minnesota, which passed just in May. So this is moving very, very quickly. You'll see that there are some other states noted in gray that have introduced packaging EPR laws over the last few years. Some of them have come up for a few years in a row, like we anticipate that this will continue rolling out. And then you'll see a couple of other states in which something called a study bill has been passed. And what that basically means is that they're in the process of setting the stage to implement EPR. And part of the reason that I show you this map is because, number one, states on both coasts and in the middle of the country have passed packaging EPR laws. They represent about 17% of the US population. And secondly, it's really important to remember that this does not just affect you if you are based in one of these states. If you sell into any of these states in e-commerce or retail or any other capacity, then this affects you. You will need to pay fees into that state. So it's really important to stay on top of what's happening here, because especially with a place like California, like the 4th largest economy in the world, this is going to have nationwide implications. So you'll see that I have noted on here several of the different program start dates for these various states. None of them are actually in effect yet, even though these laws have passed. So this is the time to be getting ahead of what's going to be required of you before this all hits us like a freight train pretty soon. So based on that, we're going to deep dive a little bit into California, just to give you a sense of what these laws say, what some of the requirements are, partly because California is probably the state that we get the most questions about, and it's just so large. It also tends to be viewed as the one that has the most kind of onerous law in terms of requirements. So we'll start there and get into some specifics. So the California EPR law is called SB 54. And basically their goal is very similar to other EPR laws in that they're trying to ensure that producers of single-use packaging and also of plastic single-use food serviceware take responsibility for those end-of-life costs. They're also trying to ensure that materials become either recyclable or compostable sometime in the near future. They're also working to improve and harmonize curbside collection programs throughout the state. And this is a really big deal because, as you probably know, sometimes the recycling rules in your county will be different from your neighbor's county. Like things can be so different, even at a very local level, about what your recycling or waste rules are. And so a lot of these states have these goals to have one statewide curbside recycling list. That's a really big deal. So we see that in California. In California, they define the producer as the entity that sells, offers for sale, imports or distributes the covered materials. When we say covered materials, we just mean the packaging materials that they name, which is virtually all packaging materials. And then there are some exemptions in there for small businesses. The small business exemptions are a little bit different from state to state, but in California, they just say a small business is one whose annual gross sales is less than $1 million. I mentioned that at its heart, a packaging EPR law has this fee structure where they're charging you fees based on the amount and type of packaging they use, that you use as a brand. But what we often see in these laws as well are some other mandates. And this is not, what I'm showing you on this slide is not kind of EPR in its purest sense. This is just stuff that was kind of tacked on to the EPR law. So in California, for example, there is this mandate that all of these covered packaging materials should be recyclable or compostable by 2032. And that's a really big ask, right? Like we're going to have to transform a lot of different kinds of packaging if we're going to meet that goal. And then they also mandate that by 2032, that the state reach a 65% recycling and composting rate, with some intermediate kind of stair-step goals along the way. And 65% is really high, considering that about 5% of post-consumer plastic waste was recycled in the US in 2021. There's also a requirement that brands need to achieve a 25% plastic source reduction goal by 2032, meaning that you need to demonstrate that you're using about a quarter less plastic in your packaging by 2032, and that's something that needs to be demonstrated. There's basically a de facto ban on expanded polystyrene food serviceware. Expanded polystyrene is basically styrofoam. That's just kind of the generic name for styrofoam. Probably not super applicable to people on this call, but that's a really big deal because EPS is a particularly pernicious kind of resin, especially with food serviceware that tends to get littered. And then lastly, they have a mandate that the producers and plastic manufacturers basically pay $500 million a year for 10 years in environmental mitigation funds. So the idea here is that they want to fund a lot of cleanup of plastic pollution that has already happened in and off the coast of California. So this is pretty onerous, right? Like all of these different mandates that are on top of the fee structures that I mentioned earlier. So since this law is not actually in effect yet, let's talk about the things that we know about it now and the things that we're waiting to know. So what we know, especially based on what I just told you, is that source reduction of plastic is very high priority, meaning just cutting down on the total amount of plastic that you're using in your packaging. We also know that a lot of items are not going to be able to be labeled as recyclable with that kind of infamous chasing arrow symbol, unless they're accepted by recycling programs that serve about 60% of the state's population. That's kind of how the state, and honestly, like most of the nation, defines recyclable. Is it needs to be collected by programs serving about 60% of the population. So you can't just slap a recycling logo on stuff and say that that means that it's recyclable. We know that compostable materials will need to be certified. That's probably not super salient to folks on this call, but compostables play a role in here as well. And then one of the things we also know is that brands/producers can get some credit for source reductions that they have done between 2013 and 2022, if it is well documented. So I mentioned that you have a 25% source reduction for plastic mandate. If you already have been working on reducing the amount of plastic in your packaging, the goal of this law is not to penalize you for taking early action on that. It's to reward you for taking action on that. So there are mechanisms to get credit for that work that you've already done. So what don't we know? Probably the question I get most often is, well, what are the fees on the different materials? We don't know yet. They are in the process of being proposed by the PRO, by the Circular Action Alliance, and then they will need to be approved by the state agency and by the advisory board. We actually don't know these fee rates on any for any of the states yet. It's going to be a little bit, but talk to me in a year. It could be a very, very interesting development based on how these are proposed. So it's a little bit hard to estimate how this is actually going to hit financially. We also don't really know what happens to materials if they don't reach that 65% recycling or composting rate by 2032. So just as an example, let's just say you're talking about like a potato chip bag. Today's potato chip bag is not recyclable, like not by a long shot. Very complicated piece of material, not accepted for recycling virtually anywhere. So people are understandably asking, well, we don't really have a great alternative to packaged chips today. What if we don't get to a 65% recycling rate for the potato chip bag by 2032? Does the material get banned? And different people have kind of different interpretations of what is going to happen in that case. My prediction is that they are not going to get banned. There are going to be these kinds of like phase-in approaches for some of these materials where we don't have viable alternatives yet. But these are important questions to ask, obviously, because there are a lot of different types of packages that we don't recycle or compost very well today. So we want to have some sense of certainty about what happens to them if they don't reach these mandates. To the extent that we can, we obviously want to be trying to find ways to get our materials to be recyclable or compostable by 2032 if possible. So what happens next in California? Well, CAA, the Circular Action Alliance, has been working to register all of these producers in Colorado, California, and Oregon. There was an initial kind of soft deadline of registering by July 1st of this year, but you can still register with them. It's free. So they are trying to basically get their club of producers more or less documented so that they can be in touch with the folks who will be obligated to pay these fees, which may include many of you. CalRecycle, which is the state agency in charge of implementing this law, has been working on publishing a list of, well, what are the categories of packaging that are covered by this law? Spoiler alert, it's basically every type of packaging that you can think of, but that list is now published. You can find it. That is not the case in every state, but it is in California. So what happens not next year, but the following year is that the Circular Action Alliance is going to submit a program plan to be reviewed by the advisory board and by the state. And what that program plan is basically going to say is, here are the fees that we're proposing. Here's how they are going to reimburse municipalities and improve the recycling and composting systems. And here's how we're going to achieve those mandates. So when that plan gets approved, it is imperative that brands are registered with CAA in order to continue to sell materials into California. You won't be allowed to sell them into California anymore if by the time this plan gets rolled out, you're not a member of that PRO. So that's all very scary. Let's talk about the ways that you can proactively set yourself up for success as this is all being rolled out. So the first thing I would say to do, if you take nothing else away from this, is just go ahead and register as a producer with CAA. You really have nothing to lose here because it's free and it takes about 3 minutes. There's a QR code down here, and we can also share this presentation afterward, but you can just go to the Circular Action Alliance website and there's a very clear link for where to register. If you sell anything into Colorado, you must register. This is a statutory deadline by October 1st of this year, which is like 3 weeks from now. So I highly suggest that you go ahead and do this. And by registering, you're not only staying compliant with the law, but Circular Action Alliance will keep you informed of various requirements. They're trying to reduce free riders in the system, like making sure that everyone's paying their fair share. And that gives them more data to inform the fee schedules that they're going to propose. So again, it just takes like 3 minutes and you just kind of need to provide like a contact on there. And CAA also has a lot of good education on their website, especially once you've registered as a producer, about how else this law impacts you. The other thing you can go ahead and start doing now is gathering your existing packaging data. So I recommend going back and gathering your 2022, 23, and 24 packaging data, because each of these states is using kind of a different benchmark, like whatever their benchmark year is, for how much packaging is being sold into that state. So what I typically recommend is that you gather SKU level packaging data, basically to get a total weight and type of material. So I want you to be able to answer the question, how much cardboard did I sell into the state of Oregon in 2023? You want to be able to have a sense of that. And I realize that those data might be kind of difficult to pull together. So you might as well start working on that now and figuring out what do you need to do in your own systems to gather that data, because you are going to need it. So figure that out for the past few years so that you can do that on an ongoing basis moving forward. Better to do that now than when you're in some kind of rush against some kind of deadline later. Also, if you've made any efforts so far to reduce your packaging or use more recyclable materials, this is also a great time to go ahead and document it as well as you can with metrics. As I mentioned earlier, you'll probably be able to get credit for that work that you've already done. So to the extent that you can gather data about, oh, well, in mid-2023, we switched from a plastic air pillow to a paper-based void fill for our e-commerce orders. Like, you want to be able to document, well, here's how much that plastic weighed and how much we were selling of it per year. And that's the amount of plastic that we were able to avoid selling into the state once we switched to a paper option. So the more that you can have those kinds of initiatives documented, the better off you'll be. If you go ahead and keep making changes, I would say just document them very carefully so that you can get as much credit as possible for the work that you're doing. But go ahead and look for those opportunities to reduce your packaging more and move to more recyclable materials. So the pictures that I have on this slide are some examples of things that we do here at Atlantic Packaging Solutions Center in Charlotte. We often have brands send us the packaging that they're using and ask us to redesign it to use only curbside recyclable materials. So like at the top, for instance, we were working with Rife, which makes goggles and snorkels, to take out any plastic packaging and make a completely fiber-based alternative that was recyclable. So we do that for brands pretty frequently. Also remember that as you're reviewing your current inventory of packaging, you should be careful to review what products you're labeling as recyclable, and only labeling them as recyclable if a lot of people, 60+%, actually have access to recycle that kind of packaging. There are some other laws in the books. In California, there's one called SB 343 that has legislation about when you can use that chasing arrow symbol. So you don't want to accidentally just be labeling things as recyclable if they're not actually recyclable. And we can talk more about that later if anyone wants to. I would also recommend creating alliances and partnerships to manage difficult materials. And industry associations like ASA are a really good place to do that. So as I mentioned, for some types of packaging, it's going to be really hard to reach a 65% recycling rate unless we go into these partnerships together to take back or recycle items that are unlikely to be recycled curbside. So you may need to be more open source and collaborative, even with competitors, obviously in a way that doesn't violate any laws, about taking back certain kinds of packages. So what we have in the picture here is one of Atlantic's highest volume products is stretch film that goes around big pallets of goods. And this is something that consumers never see, so it doesn't go through our curbside recycling systems, but it is very recyclable if we can get it back from the businesses that we sell it to. So we created kind of a closed loop system where we are taking back stretch film from some of our most strategic customers in the Southeast. And this is something that we never would have thought to do if there weren't these kinds of mandates in place, like stretch film needs to reach this 65% recycling rate. And so working with our customers in this kind of unprecedented way to get our product back was one of those ways that we could do this. So the way that you're going to do this is going to look very different because your products are very different. The folks in your supply chain are very different, but be looking along your supply chain and even among your competitors to see what are some ways that we can actually work together to get our materials back or to make them more recyclable altogether. I also recommend just bringing your consumers along for this journey. Your packaging at the end of the day is a brand attribute. It is entirely part of that unboxing experience for consumers. It tells your end users what your values are as a brand. So as you're making changes to that packaging, communicate with your customer base about what you're doing and why. Also, to the extent that you can have responsible disposal instructions on that packaging, that's really useful. People really want to know what to do with the packaging when they're done with it. They want an honest assessment of like, hey, you need to throw away this piece and you can recycle this piece. So be educating your consumers on your packaging about what to do with it. And then lastly, I would suggest assigning someone on your team to keep up with EPR happenings. This person should probably be the one who registers your brand with CAA, so that they are the main point of contact and they get those emails. They can also be the one to sign up for that CAA newsletter or join the various webinars. Just having someone who's kind of on point to do this can help you avoid missing like a key deadline. So just see who internally makes sense to be the one keeping up with this. So aside from some of CAA's resources, which are awesome, we also have a variety of resources here at A New Earth Project with more explanations about EPR, how it might affect you. We have these both on the anewearthproject.com website as well as atlanticpkg.com. We have a bunch of resources. We know that this is difficult, so we're trying to make it easier for our customers and any company using packaging to comply here. And then just to go back to this slide for a moment, there are also, of course, state-specific packaging EPR pages that are linked in this presentation. So you could click California, for instance, and have it take you to the page specific to the California legislation. So when you get this deck, you can click through there, see if there's anything helpful. Just to note that there's not a lot on Minnesota yet because it was only passed in May. So that one is still a very much moving target. But from there, I will stop. I know that that was a whirlwind of information, and we can get into a Q&A. And again, if there was anything that we went over too fast, happy to go back to it and re-explain.
Excellent job as always, Caroline. Thank you so much. There haven't been any questions that have popped up in the chat, so I'm going to open up to those that are still on the call. If anybody wants to raise their hand or drop the question now in the chat. So we have about 10 minutes to be able to answer any questions. Mike.
Hey, Lynn. Yeah, so really interesting and kind of eye-opening information, just in terms of the scale of this and the timelines and the level of impact. We've dealt with this on a few other topics recently of this patchwork of states, and it often tends to be the same states that you had mentioned here, taking separate, similar, but also slightly different approaches to these types of topics. Has there been discussion at the federal level of kind of a catch-all, how to consolidate, and instead of businesses having to keep up with a bunch of different regulations that have some overlap, but also some distinction, of just having sort of a one-size-fits-all approach across the country? Is there any movement towards that type of effort?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there was a federal law proposed a couple of years ago that had no chance of passing and continues to have no chance of passing, at least for right now. But what I suspect is that as more states implement this, then even the folks who have been kind of oppositional to the idea of seeing EPR in more states may start to be okay with seeing this rolled out at the federal level, simply because it is such a pain to have it be different from each state. So at some point, we're going to reach this tipping point where there are enough states who have this that everyone just kind of says, like, look, we just need this to be federal. And so hopefully that will happen before this gets too cumbersome, but I don't anticipate it in the next year or two.
And then another one on, I know you mentioned states sort of being the, I don't know, enforcers or the ones ensuring that there's compliance. What do you see that looking like, especially in the early going when awareness might not be at its peak in terms of businesses knowing what they have to comply with? Because I imagine there could be a lot of need in terms of enforcement when deadlines start looming.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So a little bit of it is state dependent. I imagine at the beginning, the main thing we're going to see is fines. So brands will probably realize like, oh, I had no idea that this was even happening or that I was supposed to be a member of this thing in order to keep selling stuff in. And so they'll kind of hastily join the PRO, and there may be some kind of fine for late compliance. For a lot of the states, it's not going to be the state agency that's going in looking for these folks. It might be at the like attorney general level where some of this is happening. So we could eventually see things like lawsuits or what have you, but I do think that some of that compliance will be a slow roll and will mostly be fines. If a brand is still being pretty non-compliant, even with those fines, it could result in them not being allowed to sell into that state anymore until they figure out how to comply. I mean, that would be kind of the big hammer here, is that you're not allowed to sell into the state anymore. But I don't think we have a great sense of what that's going to look like in the short term.
And sorry, I keep having questions, even though
No,
I'm
it's
not a packaging producer. For a lot of our companies who I imagine are outsourcing their packaging, at what level are the actual producers of the packaging itself? I don't know, keeping up with this, informing brands of regulatory changes, or adapting their packaging to help brands with complying with these laws. Because I imagine at some level, a lot of the brands are just kind of caught up in almost being the middleman in the process, to where ultimately it's the ones producing the package themselves that are the most responsible here, it seems.
Yeah, that's a good question too. So those of us who are further up the supply chain than the brands tend to be a little bit more aware than some of the brands themselves that this is coming, just because we get this kind of industry news in the way that a lot of brands don't. And that's exactly why we, for instance, are doing what we're doing right now, is because we know that this is going to affect our customers. And so we're trying to make sure that they are staying on top of it, because it'll create a panic for all of us if all of us suddenly have to change over the packaging that we're helping you as a brand use. So what's kind of interesting about the way that this is going to work ultimately is that even though you're probably not making your packaging yourself, you have a manufacturer, supplier for various types of packaging, but ultimately you, the brand, are going to be the one who pays these fees, because you are the decision maker about what kind of packaging you use, and so you're the one who is held accountable. But I will say that most of the packaging manufacturers, like us included, are trying to make sure that brands are aware of this. I would say that a lot of those big Fortune 500 CPGs and stuff, like, they are all over this. It's mostly making sure that a lot of the smaller and mid-sized companies are staying on top of this, because a lot of this information isn't permeating down. So in some ways, that's why we've taken on some of this educational responsibility.
Yeah, it makes sense. It seems indirect for the brand to ultimately be responsible, but at the same time, I can understand from an enforcement standpoint, they're the ones who are, their product is the one that's being sold. So
their product is the one being sold, and they're the ones who tell us, their supplier, what kind of packaging they want to use. So we can't really be like, the suppliers and the manufacturers can't really be the ones penalized for the brand's packaging decisions. Ultimately, the brands have to be the ones to decide, hey, we want to use less packaging or more recyclable packaging or whatever. So ultimately, the onus is on the brands.
any other questions from anyone?
Well, if no one has any questions, I could just jump in really quick and just say, oh, sorry, Don, go ahead.
Hey, Rick, how you doing? I just
Hey,
wanted
good.
to make a very quick statement. Hi, my name's Don Meek. I'm with the New Earth Project, and I'm so proud of Lynn and Caroline for this webinar. Thank you all so much for this, and thank you for inviting us to do this. We are very focused on working with brands to help them navigate this transition that is going to take place. And when you start to think about the impact that EPR in California, which represents a very significant percentage of sales for the fishing industry in the United States, we want to work with brands to help them do that. So whether it's a lure being packaged in a PVC clamshell, and we can help move you into a fiber-based folding carton, those are the types of things that we feel very positioned very well to help do that. And we're doing it because we have a profound commitment as a company to solving this issue. So I just wanted to kind of jump on that particular topic. And because ultimately it is the brands that tell us what kind of packaging they want. So if we can be helpful in guiding the industry to a better outcome, then we feel that, and we are starting to develop relationships in Asia where I know so much of the manufacturing is done, and it's all contract packaging from the manufacturer to the packager, and then shipping from Asia to the United States to a distribution center or wherever it might be. We have started to build some templates and prototypes for helping people get out of those clamshells, which is a big part of how fishing lures are packaged. And the other thing that I would like to share very clearly is that we're really concerned about business to consumer packaging, where it has that packaging itself has the potential for slipping out into the wild. So when I go fishing and someone opens up I need you guys to tell me. I've now heard Rapala said Rapala and Rapala, so I'm not exactly sure, but you open up your lure, and that polyvinyl, that PVC clamshell, you have a gust of wind and it's off the boat. So again, these are the types of things that we care about and really have made a commitment to helping the industry figure out. So thank you for letting me jump in.
Rapala, but I grew up calling it Rapala, just for the record.
I was going to ask that. I did see that they're making some improvements to their packaging, so kudos to them. But yeah, I would just say if there's no other questions, just something to consider as just someone who's taking the position as I'm a sustainability consultant. Is that with any of this, right? You want things that are good for the environment. You want things that are good for your bottom line. And I think that the idea is that if you can if you know regulations coming and you can get ahead of it, you have an opportunity to gain a first mover advantage that could be beneficial for your brand. So just as everyone has a lot to kind of drinking out of a fire hose with this, just to sort of simplify it as like, what's another reason? To me, that's where my head goes with it. I'm like, I want to be a first mover to hopefully affect positive change. So just throwing that out there.
Yeah, John, go ahead.
Yeah, there's also been a push recently with RFID tags. Do those conflict with this? Because I can see these things where, we're asking for one thing and then other, online sellers or Walmarts are asking for something else and they kind of collide. Has that been addressed yet?
Can you help me understand why they would collide?
I don't know if there's the metal pieces inside the RFID tag or not recyclable, or, does that count? I mean, because now you're kind of adding another thing onto a package to make it, compliant to the store, but then it might collide with this.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I haven't heard the RFID tag specifically brought up, but there are a lot of conversations going about various kinds of markings or tags that packaging should probably start to carry to improve its recyclability. So in the very fun world of recycling sortation machinery, is there a world in which there are these kinds of tags on packaging that the machines can read to help sort different materials? So if anything, I think they're probably compatible. But for the actual like pieces of metal that might be like embedded in packaging, my inclination is to say that whoever is trying to embed like RFID tags is trying to do so in a way that doesn't obstruct recycling machinery from being able to kind of read the type of packaging. And I doubt that it's large enough to be a problem. But if anything, I'm hoping that they're kind of compatible, especially to give like consumers better instructions about what to do with packaging and give the machines better instructions about how to sort it. But that'll be an interesting space to watch. Good question.
Yeah. Well, I guess I was also concerned too with the fact that there's metal inside paper. And I don't know if how they separate that during recycling. I have no idea, but it was just something I thought of.
It would be very small, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, they're
Yeah.
pretty small, but just another hoping that it doesn't collide with the compliance issue.
For sure. I mean, our packaging recycling systems are really good at getting out various contaminants. And I imagine that one is not large enough to be a problem. If you coated the whole thing in metal, that could be a problem,
Yeah.
but pieces that small, I imagine would not be an issue.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Good question.
Great. Thank you.
We probably have time for one more if anyone has any. Cool. Well, I put my email in the chat if you have anything you were feeling shy to ask and wanted to hop in with. And then Lynn and I have put a variety of resources in the chat as well. As you can tell, we have a lot of explainers and collateral out there to help you out. So feel free to reach out with questions. We're here to help.
Yeah, and I'll just plug real quick our newsletter, the New Earth Project newsletter. I would highly recommend if you are wanting to follow along and wanting to learn more as things start to reveal themselves in the next few months. We every month or every few weeks drop an email into people's inboxes with more information. So highly recommend connecting in that way.
Well, I'll just say, I'll jump in one last time. Thank everyone for joining. Thanks, Lynn. Thanks, Caroline. Thanks, ASA, for bringing this info to your members. And yeah, thanks, Mike, for putting this all together.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will, of course, have this recorded and share this afterwards for folks that weren't able to join, because this is a lot of really great information that I think most all of our members need to get their hands on. So we'll do our best to make sure the information gets out there and include contact information, and hope we have some good follow-up, because we certainly, the theme here, we don't want folks to get caught flat-footed here. We want them to be out ahead of these types of things for a variety of reasons. So thanks, Rick, Caroline, Lynn. Really appreciate your time and insights. And with that, we'll close off. So have a great rest of the day, everyone.
All right.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.